Well, welcome. This is Conversations with the Vice Provost. My name is Michael Dennin, and I'm our Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning, Dean of the Division of Undergraduate Education here at UC Irvine. This is a chance for me to sit down, talk with leaders within our community about various important issues that are both impacting UCI, UC as a system, California, the nation, and hopefully even the world. And it's my pleasure today to be with Professor Anita Casavantes-Bradford, both a professor in Chicano Latino Studies and a professor of history. Anita, maybe introduce yourself briefly, if there's anything to add.
Hi, I'm Anita Casavantes-Bradford. I'm an associate professor, as Michael Dennin already said, of history and Chicano Latino Studies. I'm also the director of UCI's First Generation Faculty Initiative.
So I would like to just start with that, the First Gen Students, First Gen Faculty Initiative. You know, it's something, I think this is kind of an interesting contrast, you and I. You're first gen, I'm nth gen or something, I don't know. Well, I don't know actually past my parents how many people went to college, but somehow past that it's not really noticeable because my dad's a professor at a university, my mom's a high school teacher, you know, education, and I grew up at a university, so it's a very different experience. Maybe just start, if you don't mind, one or two things. I've heard you talk about how, you know, there wasn't a name for it when you were a student. Mm-hmm. When maybe afterwards did you realize you had been first gen, and what was kind of the impact of that? And I know I didn't warn you with that question, but it just hit me now.
That's a really important question because I think about my experience when I went to university. So I was the first, not just the first in my family to go to university, I was the first woman in my family to finish high school. My mother went to 10th grade, and I think her mother probably went to 9th or 10th grade as well. My mother was from a large working-class Irish-Canadian family. My dad is Cuban-Spanish, right? So I'm a Latino-Irish girl. But neither of them, you know, graduated from university. So when I went to university, I was really entering into a space that I'd seen on television.
Okay.
And that I knew that going to university was how you changed your life. And I had grown up largely raised by my mother in a welfare-dependent household. You know, economic insecurity, poverty, sort of all, it was really my defining experience as a child. And I knew that if I wanted something different, I needed to go to this place called the university. Get a degree and get a job, right? But arriving at the university, I started meeting people, students, and the students in my classes, their parents were all, they were doctors, they were accountants, they were these exotic, bewildering things to me that I'd never known anybody who had those kind of jobs, right? And so I was immediately surrounded by people who I thought, oh, I can't go to their houses. Okay. I can't talk to their parents because when they ask me what my parents do, what will I say, right? I can't invite them to my home because I'm embarrassed of my home, right? Ridiculous. When you're young, you're embarrassed of things that later you become proud of, right? I'm proud of my parents and how hard they worked, but at the time.
No, it makes perfect sense.
Right? And so at the time, the experience of being a first-generation student was not something that I imagined I shared with other people on my campus. I viewed it as a personal problem, right? As a product of the inadequacies of my own family and as something to hide, right? That is very different from the environment in which first-generation students enter into the university now.
Now, do you think that's both due to our efforts, but is there also a sense on their side that, you know, we're trying to celebrate it, obviously. We think it's important. We really value it. We take great pride in being a place of social mobility and social change. Is that something the majority of our first generation students are coming with as well as an attitude already? Or is it something they gain from the experiences here that we provide them? Probably it's both, but what's kind of your sense as you meet and interact with the students?
I would say there's both, and it also depends on the communities that students come from, right? One of the sort of hidden secrets of the kind of differences between American communities, right, that are still, for better or for worse, defined largely by race and ethnicity in ways that we wish they weren't, right? One of the sort of hidden secrets to the mainstream is that when you go into in my case, I can speak sort of from a personal perspective. When you go into Latino communities, working class Latino communities, where the majority of the adults are not university graduates, where many of them are of low-income backgrounds, the understanding in those communities that education is life or death is prevalent. Right? Okay. That, however, is not necessarily the way that the mainstream media or popular culture imagines that Latinos feel about education. I hear, even from educated progressive friends, comments like, well, you know, their culture doesn't value education in the same way. And I'm always horrified and surprised when I hear that from educated people, right? Because it couldn't be further from the truth, right? My own husband, who is Anglo-American, when we first married, sort of had that worldview. Okay. And I took him to an education fair in the southern part of San Diego County that was organized by Latino community organizations, just for him to see what it's really like in the neighborhood, right? The way that people perceive education. And we spent 4 hours at a community fair that was, you know, local bands were playing, there were booths, there was free food, et cetera, et cetera. And from the central stage, after the band played every 2 or 3 songs, a local Latino educator would get up and say, now bring the students forward, you know, education, it's the future, yada, yada, right? Like, this is the discourse in our communities, right? I would venture to say that in most African American communities as well, that the understanding that education is life or death is prevalent.
Would you say you know, you mentioned from your experience coming here and being a little shocked, you know, lawyers, doctors, accountants, the kind of jobs people's parents had. Is there a particular goal these communities have for the kids in terms of a career afterwards? Right. Or is it just more of a general sense of you will have a better life? Because that could be a difference from your experience.
So, and this is where there might be a difference between the discourses, the pro-education discourses that we find in low-income communities in the US and the pro-education discourses that we find in middle-class, largely white communities. Our Latino communities absolutely encourage kids to get an education, but that encouragement tends to be, and this was my experience with my father, who was determined that I was going to get a college education, but the details of that and precisely how that would translate into a career, kind of vague. Right? Because, of course, he didn't have that experience, right? Nor did most of the members of my community. They knew that education was the path to a better life. The details and how to fill that in were different. Students who come from continuing generation families whose parents went to university often also receive pro-education discourses and messages at home. But what they also receive is a set of really detailed and targeted and precise information on, you're going to go to college, and when you get there, it's going to be like this, because when I was there, it was like this. And this is exactly how you succeed. And then you're going to get an internship, and then you're going to have specific summer jobs, and it's going to lead you towards a career that looks like mine. And so it's not that there's a difference in the valuing of post-secondary education between our different racial and ethnic communities. It's how much detail and how much sort of targeted advice can be provided by parents who have or have not gone to university.
So that's, I think, a natural lead-in to kind of the second question and area that I'm very interested in is, you know, again, in my role as the Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning, Dean of Undergraduate, the way too long of a title I have, you know, one of our jobs is to look at the institutional structures and ask the question, how do we best help all the students here? There's a great comment by my counterpart at UC Davis. She often talks about the fact that faculty will complain about the students we have. Oh, they're this or they're that. They're not like they were in the good old days, right? And her comment is, but they're the students. I mean, if you look at it, we are accepting the best and the brightest, for however you define that. You may argue over whether we can define the best or the brightest, but we offer incredible access, I feel, compared to what used to be achievable. Maybe we have room to grow and all of that, but we're doing great with access. We're admitting students, and I'm going to use the word diversity here, and often people hear that and they just think ethnic or racial diversity, but it's diversity in so many different ways, right? There's a vast difference to our students' experiences as they come in. And many of their experiences, their goals, their dreams, the way they think about the world are different than ours as faculty. Even though we come from a variety of backgrounds, we've sort of been shaped, we share this very common experience of becoming professors, which, as you know, is kind of a strange and bizarre process that molds you in a certain way. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us as the university to look closely at our structures and say, are we really presenting the right scaffolding, the right tools, the right elements that our students need to understand both to understand what success is and to be successful. Not that we need to define success for them, because that's dangerous, but perhaps hint at possibilities they may not have considered before. That's a very broad statement. It's not really a question, but I'll pretend it was and see if you have a reaction to it, Anita.
No, I do. I mean, I think that when we look at institutionally, what can we be doing to encourage success amongst this more diverse population that we now have? Yes, I mean, access to the University of California system is, open access to it for the best and the brightest of the state is kind of the hallmark of the system, right? We could have a separate conversation about how expensive it's getting and what that means for access, but let's put that aside for the moment, right? Yeah. Part of the reason that I think that we are having such success with first-generation students at Irvine is that we are really getting already the most talented and the most accomplished of the first-generation students that the state has to offer, right? Yeah. So we're starting with some pretty great raw material, right?
No, that helps.
That does help us, right? And we know from education research in the K through 12 system that one of the most important determiners of success in K through 12 education is the educational and socioeconomic background of the parents, right? So we know that in the K through 12 system, what students are bringing with them into the school is a big determinant of their success. So let's be honest about the fact that part of our success with first-generation students here is what our first-gen students are bringing with them when they come here. No, they're smart, they're determined, and they're accomplished, right? So that's part of it. From that, though, what is it that we can be doing to help them to be even more successful? Because I would like to see UC Irvine become a school where there is no discernible GPA gap between continuing and first-generation students, right?
That's definitely our goal. We would love to achieve that.
Right. So how do we get there? One of the first things we do, which I think we're doing through the first-generation faculty initiatives, through some of our other programs, is beginning to help students to understand that they are a majority here. Their experience is not only prevalent, it is the majority experience, and that's a good thing, and we're proud of it, and it is not a disadvantage, right? If we can start from that place, then we are setting these students up to succeed.
I think that's a great point. I do think one of the things, in addition to that, though, that I've noticed, which is, I think, a challenge not just for our first-gen students, it's a challenge for all our students. And this is something I say every year when I talk to the parents at our parent orientation. I point out to them that time is a fundamentally different concept at the university than it is in K through 12. And it's particularly bad, I think, for successful students in high school. Because if you're a bright, successful student, you do your homework more because it's assigned and you kind of have to and it's expected. The reality is, whether consciously or not, you're probably aware that you could get by even if you didn't do it. Class was enough. And then you do some fraction. And of course, at the university, they're in class for 3 hours a week for a given class. And we expect them to do that 8 or 10 hours outside. And this concept that you're now an independent learner, I wonder if we're doing enough to help students make that transition. And then also, ultimately, what do we do? And this is not really necessarily first gen. This may be more a low income. There's obviously large overlap, but it's not a one-to-one correspondence. There's sort of 3 competitions for a student's time. Their studies, what I'll call the fun stuff of college. You've mentioned Irvine has some advantages there. Maybe you can touch on that again. Not the most exciting or distracting of cities. But then there's also work, which some students, I think our students at the two extremes have challenge. The higher end, often, the upper middle class are often told by their parents, work because it's good for you. And they are doing too many hours working that they don't need. Or if you really want that third iPhone, you need to work for it. I'm not going to give it to you. and then you have the students whose families need their income. Or and they're having to work. And for those students, there's only a limited amount of time. And I'm wondering, that's a space that I think seems one of the biggest challenges for us as an institution. How do we help students with time? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you are just sort of in the same boat I am, is, oh, we need good ideas and let's start thinking.
No, I mean, I think there's two really important things. And the first one is that one of the sort of foundations of good pedagogy is to be explicit and to be transparent.
Right.
But that means that we have to actually be a little meta, and we have to think about what our own assumptions are and what it is that we expect students to already know. Why is it that we expect students to already know that their work week for university should be 45 or 50 hours, right? 50, right? I say this out loud at the beginning of every class that I teach, and it's not specific guidance just for my class, it's for their university experience. I say, so for this class, you're going to be in class this many hours. I do expect you to be working, 3 to 4 additional hours on readings, etc. Oh, and by the way, if you don't know, you should be overall spending about 50 hours a week on your classes and your studying and your homework, right? I acknowledge that for those of you that work, that's complicated, but that is what you should be doing, right? We need to say those things out loud, right? We have to make that clear. We often don't. Students don't know that, particularly first-generation students. They are still in the reactive high school mode where time that is programmed for them, class time, that's in their schedule.
Right.
Studying often becomes this reactive thing where, oh, I have an assignment due, I have to figure out how to get that done, I'll do that. But they're not building a full-time work schedule for themselves around their studies because no one's told them to do that, right? They don't have parents to tell them to do that because their parents, while their parents know an awful lot about working 50 and 60 hours a week, they don't know that that's what an academic week should look like, right? So that's the first thing. We have to be explicit, right? The second thing is that we have to take more seriously the profound structural inequality that divides students from middle and upper income families from low income students. And many of our first generation students are also low income, right? Look, when you're working 30 hours a week, like many of my first generation low income students are doing, when you're working 30 hours a week to help fund your increasingly expensive University of California education. Let's be honest, it's expensive, right? It's too expensive. When you're working 30 hours a week to do that, and in some cases to help your family, it is not simply a question of the will to study or the desire to study more, it's how many hours are there in a day. When I was an undergrad student working 30 hours a week as a live-in nanny and housekeeper, trying to figure out how to get up, do my paid job that provided me with food and a place to live, make it to class on time, eat, and sleep. There simply were not enough hours in a day. So I regularly slept during classes, and my grades suffered, and I was exhausted all the time. That's a structural reality, and we have to do more to help those students.
No, and I agree, and I think it's definitely one that, as a challenge to the university, I don't think clever pedagogy is going to solve. Pedagogy solves and helps a lot of things. Like you said, explicit pedagogy helps. I also, people ask me, why do we push active learning techniques? And my comment is because we're modeling in the class how they should be studying at home. It's the same thing that you've pointed out. I think the research, particularly in the STEM fields, the science and engineering and math fields, has really shown the need to increase the amount of active learning going on in the class, which is simply, in my mind, if you look at what this means, it's a buzzword, but for the people watching who don't know, it means modeling for students how we, those of us who were professors, studied on our own and were successful. And now we show them in the class, and then they can do it on their own. I think the university, it's one of our big, we like to talk about grand challenges at the university. It's our favorite thing. I think our grand challenge is time. How do we help students carve out the time they need, particularly those who don't? Since we're on challenges, let's go to probably the most challenging issue for a little bit. I know there's not a lot we can say about it because it's a moving landscape. but I think we should acknowledge and maybe make a few comments about our immigrant students, our students who either their families have, uncertainties around their immigration status, even if the student is a citizen or the student themselves is undocumented or has challenges. Given that these students are here legally, we're given a promise for an education, how do you see maybe us being able to move forward and navigate this space given its uncertainty? I think that's the thing that causes people the most trouble right now, is the uncertainty.
Right. So, first we should begin by saying that California has more than a third of the nation's undocumented population. So we're talking about almost 4 million people, right? That is a large community of people. Of that community, a tiny percentage of them make it to university. So we are already talking about a student population that has overcome tremendous adversity to even get here, that have demonstrated tremendous courage and hope to move forward in an uncertain space to even get here. These are special students. These are motivated, hardworking, brave kids, right? And we did admit them, and we have a responsibility to graduate them. We have to, in whatever way we can within the context of the law, find ways to graduate students that we've admitted, right? We don't know what the new political context is in terms of immigration, but what we do know is that it has always been difficult for undocumented students. The same difficulties that they have confronted on a daily basis up until now, right? Until recently, not being able to drive legally, financial precariousness, lack of funds, being uncertain about whether or not they can share their experience with faculty, with students, without being demonized or misunderstood, right? I could go on and on. Those problems have always existed. They will continue to exist. They're worse now because of this climate of uncertainty and of hostility towards immigrants, right? But as faculty and as a university, there are things that we can do to alleviate some of those things. First, we can begin by making sure that we talk about undocumented people in ways that are respectful and value neutral, right? First of all, we can use the term undocumented rather than illegal. In the community of advocates for undocumented people, we say no human being is illegal, right? You cannot be illegal, right? That would be like suggesting that somebody who committed some other misdemeanor crime, because being unauthorized in the United States is actually a misdemeanor offense, right? And it is breaking the law, right? But so is crossing the road on a red light, right? So somebody who has done that, right, exactly, or getting a speeding ticket, which all of us have,
without getting a ticket, which is very common in California.
So the point is that many of us have broken the law, and yet people do not refer to us as illegals, right? So let's begin first of all by recognizing the humanity of our undocumented students by referring to them as people rather than as criminals, right? So we need to make sure that our discourse in the university, anything that is published by the university, the way that our faculty speak recognizes that basic humanity, right? We can, as faculty, participate in ally trainings. We can spend 4 or 5 hours learning the basics of what our immigration law is, what are the historical circumstances that have produced such a large undocumented population in the U.S., and what are the ways that the U.S. has benefited as well as struggled with undocumented communities. Knowing that stuff and communicating that to students, particularly those of us in the social sciences and humanities, right? But allied training also does other important things, right? It provides faculty with information about resources that if an undocumented student comes to you and says, I am undocumented, I'm facing this upheaval in my family, I'm facing this situation in terms of my funding, faculty should know where to send those students. We have a Dreamers coordinator who is here to work with those students. We have a number of other people in different administrative units who are available to support those students. Participating in allied training may not make individual faculties experts on immigration history. That's my job, I'm an immigration historian. But it will provide them with a basic toolkit so that if a student asks them for help, they can say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I know where to send you, right?
And going back to something else you said, not to interrupt, I think this is critical to emphasize, our students, they may be undocumented, but they're here for very good legal reasons. in the way we've structured things in the laws that allowed them to come to UC Irvine.
Right, right. So
And-
currently, the majority of our undocumented students are DACA recipients. They are recipients of legal work permits.
Right.
And temporary permission to remain in the United States under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals executive order that was signed by President Obama in 2012. We don't know whether that is going to be rescinded, but right now, those students have a legal status that was granted to them by the federal government. They also have in California, under the California DREAM Act, the legal right to enter into our universities, to receive state financial aid. And so our state and our nation has made a promise to this particular population of students that currently possess DACA. Whether DACA goes away or not, we need to own the fact that we made a promise. And we need to try and find ways to fulfill that promise to the students that we've allowed to enter our university.
Excellent. I think that's just really important for people in the community to understand and hear. Thank you, Anita, for being willing to talk about that. I want to maybe take that idea of promise and maybe go one more step further, just sort of globally, to close with a little thought. Heard a very nice presentation I did a couple of weeks ago, and it was a good reminder. Richard Matthew, who's a professor here, was talking about universities, and someone hadn't mentioned in a long time. He reiterated how long a tradition universities have been around, and the tradition they came out of, and that underlying idea that we've talked many times about as the universities as sort of this place of hope, right, and this place where people come to kind of move forward, to maybe be challenged, to not necessarily, we hope, not necessarily stay in their comfort zone and bubble, but to really be transformed in a way that makes them a productive citizen. And I think if we go back to the sort of beginnings of this country as a country, one of our very positives we can point to is the idea that the people had who were crafting our democracy of education being at the core of a democracy, and that you really needed education to prepare citizens to be able to engage their government, their democracy, their political life. I think there's a very hopeful message there, and maybe universities had let that slide a little bit in the past, and maybe we've had a wake-up call. And I'm excited about the future for us moving forward. I don't know if you have any last thoughts in that general area of the universities as a place of hope for people?
Yeah, I think that the university is absolutely, for those of us who are of first generation and low income backgrounds particularly, the university isn't just a place of hope. This is life or death for us. Yeah. Education is the path to security, to dignity for our families, to equal treatment and participation in society. So it's not just hope, it is life or death, right? But above and beyond that, for all Americans, for everybody who lives here, we need to figure out how to think intelligently and fairly and deeply about our society and what we want our country to be.
Yeah.
And the university needs to play a leading role in educating people to think that way. And so while it is important that our universities focus on STEM education and leading us forward in innovation.
I'm glad you said
we
that.
also, it's true, it's very important. Yeah. The STEM fields as a place for social mobility for low-income and first-generation students cannot be overemphasized, right? Yeah. Careers, financial security, etc. STEM offers a lot for the communities that I work with, right? That being said, I think we are seeing some of the consequences of our underfunding and of our sort of dismissal of the importance of the liberal arts and of the humanities in the sort of the deterioration of our political discourse and our ability to tolerate differences of opinions, to push beyond our own sort of tribal identities and our own personal interests, to think about what is fair for most Americans, not just what is comfortable for me. Yeah. What are the values that hold a society together rather than just my subculture or community? We need the liberal arts as much as we need STEM in order to live together as a society.
Oh, I think that's so true. It's very exciting. I think, as you know, we've talked briefly, I was almost a history major. But no, I think that aspect of the university, that liberal arts tradition, that deep thinking about issues is something we really have to reinvigorate and bring forward, and I'm excited about. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, Anita. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, this third in our series of conversations with the Vice Provost, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Thanks for watching. This is the time where you get to be part of the conversation. Comment below. You know the drill. You know how to do that. Subscribe, follow us, look for us on all our social media, and stay part of the conversations. Thank you.